This is the interview of Douglas Whaley, conducted on May 14th, 2005 at 2:50 p.m. at his residence. Could you state your name, please?
Douglas John Whaley.
And what is your ethnic or racial background or makeup?
Caucasian, of course. My mother's family were Germans, Catholic, and settled in southern Indiana. And I had always thought that Whaley, my father's family, was an Irish name, but my sister's been doing genealogy and has discovered that they're English. But the one she's traced it back to is Nathaniel Whaley, born in 1760 in Maryland. His son was William Whaley, moved to Georgia and walked all the way from Georgia to southern Indiana, leading a horse on which was his pregnant wife in the early 1800s. And his son fought in the Civil War. His son, farmers in southern Indiana. Then my grandfather was a railroad man, and my father joined the Air Force. And I was born in Huntingburg, Indiana, but I was brought up as an Air Force brat all over the globe. It's English on the father's side and German on the mother's.
And how many siblings do you have?
One, a sister 2 years younger, married.
And if your parents were employed during your childhood, what did they do?
Mom was not. She was a housewife. My father was in the Air Force all during my childhood. He was an officer in the Air Force, retiring as a lieutenant colonel, and then he followed me. I went to law school. He followed me to the University of Texas Law School and became a prosecutor in 1970, and in Dallas, Texas, where for 10 years he was a prosecutor and a very successful one, and he died in 1980 of complications from heart troubles. And on his deathbed said, "Thank you for talking me into going to law school." He said, "In 10 years I put a lot of people in jail who should be in jail." And I was very proud of him.
What's your earliest memory?
Pensacola, Florida. When I was 4 years old, we used to live on the beach, and we used to fly kites out over the ocean and tie them down at night, and then the next morning you pull on the string, but the kite was gone. That'd be age 4.
When you were a kid, who were your heroes?
Well, my father always was. I have an enormous amount of respect for him. He was a wonderful person. Other than that, no one comes immediately to mind as someone who was a hero that I was looking up to and so forth. There were such people, just nothing jumps into my mind at this second.
All right. Today, people use a lot of different words to describe their sexual orientation. How do you describe your sexual orientation?
I'm gay.
And how old were you when you realized this?
It's an enormously complicated question, unlike the most people's stories, because I was born with a testosterone deficiency, and as a consequence, come puberty, I didn't go through puberty. That caused me to be hugely confused because I was attracted to men, but I knew on some level that something was wrong without knowing what, and I just buried it. I didn't think about it. I let myself get fat. I still had a very high voice. I didn't develop facial hair, all the normal things that happen in puberty didn't happen to me, and I disguised this by I was always very successful at everything I did. I always had a lot of personality. I was good at putting down roots fast. We'd move between my junior and senior year of high school. We switched schools, and I managed to be the editor of the school newspaper in my senior year when I hadn't been there until that summer right before. It was an Air Force community, however, people were moving in and out of the bus, and that ball got dropped and I picked it up. So I was always very popular, and I made it very clear I had no sexual life at all. To the extent I had sexual thoughts, and there were quite a bit of them, they all involved men. But I did almost nothing at all about it. I was in law school when I learned that I was born with a testosterone deficiency, at which point I went to an endocrinologist and started getting testosterone shots, and at age 23 I went through puberty. While in my second year of law school, that was a thrilling period. Suddenly all the normal changes occurred. I dropped a lot of weight. I started working out regularly, and I was sexually attracted to more or less everything that moved. And I thought that the homosexual thing was just a matter of being trapped by the biological problems, and that now I would become heterosexual, and I started sleeping with women, a lot of them. And I got married. I'm a father. I have a son, Clayton, who's now 32 years old. And my reaction to sex with women has always been exactly the same as my reaction to bowling. It's something I could do, that I enjoyed it. I was once in 2 leagues, bowling leagues at the exact same time, that I was even good at. And if I never did it again, I didn't care. But I was trying to pretend that bowling was the most important thing in my life. And things were going along pretty well. I had really hot sex with women and with my wife, who was and is a wonderful person. We had a good sex life till she got pregnant. And her doctor told her no sex in the final 3 months of pregnancy, nor for 3 months thereafter. That's a 6-month period where we laid off. And during that period, the homosexual thoughts came back very strong. And for a long while, I thought the whole testosterone thing had something to do with my being gay. That is, that it created that. I no longer think that. I think I was always gay, and this was just a complication that I had to get over. In 1975, exactly 30 years ago, my wife and I had moved back from North Carolina. I'm a professor of law, and I had started at Indianapolis Law School in 1970. And I married one of my law students, Charlene Adelaide. We moved to North Carolina for the 73-74 school year because I was a visiting professor at the University of North Carolina. We moved back to Indianapolis, and in 1975, marijuana came into our lives in a big way. This was the 70s. And Charlene, who I married, was always something of a hippie. She's the person who taught me to smoke marijuana. And marijuana was very, very good for me. It allowed me to calm down. It allowed me to think. And it allowed me to really search what was going on in a way I had never done before. And I got to the point, in 1975, I did a lot of this. I would sit in an absolutely black room that was totally silent and get high and just think for hours. And I decided that I was gay. So Charlene and I sat down and talked about it. I had an offer from Ohio State University to be a visiting professor just for the winter and spring, where they were on the quarter system then, of 1976. And Charlene said to me, why don't you go to Columbus, explore this world? It'd be an awful thing to be a homosexual and not know it. So with her blessing, in January of 1976, I moved to Columbus, Ohio. And I certainly wanted to stay here. The law school that I had left, Indianapolis, was in the middle of an absolute turmoil. In December of 75, at our final faculty meeting I attended there, I made a motion that we censure the dean for outrageous conduct unless he apologized to the faculty for what he had done. And then I was the first person in his office the next day to tell him he had to resign, to no longer remain as dean. He said he was going to dig in his heels, and the school was then in just chaos. And I came here hoping that Ohio State would keep me on. I was told that there was no chance of that because they weren't hiring any more white males. The one member of the faculty, John Quigley, who turns up as one of the heroes of the gay community, even though he's a straight man, he was a communist. He was always on the far left. He told me later, I voted against you, Doug, when you came up. He said, but if I'd have known you were gay, he said, I'd have voted for you fast. So I was a member of the minority without anyone knowing it. At the end of the 2 quarters, however, I won the Outstanding Professor Award. The graduating class voted me that, and then they had to make me an offer. So I was very relieved to stay on, and I stayed on until the summer of 2004 when I finally retired, after what is more or less 30 years here at Ohio State. I forgot what the original question was, but
It was...
how did I figure out I was gay?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the answer. And of course, as soon as I made it to Columbus, Ohio, I plunged into the gay world. Now, the first time I was here was in the late fall, early winter of '75, because I was looking for housing. And I wanted to go to a gay bar. I'd never been to a gay bar. And I didn't have a clue on how to find one. So I had a good idea. I thought, I got out the Yellow Pages, I looked up cocktail lounges, I picked one at random that was on Gay Street. I called them up and I said, is this a gay bar? Knowing that the answer would be no. He said, no, it's not. I said, what's the name of the gay bar? He said, the Kismet. I said, thank you. And I looked up the Kismet in the phone book. You heard of the Kismet? I looked up the Kismet and figured out where it was. So on a Friday night at 8 o'clock in the evening, what did I know? I went down to the Kismet. This would have been December of '75.
Where was the Kismet located at that time?
It's now the Columbus Eagle.
So they're on 3rd Street?
Yeah, that's it. That's the old Kismet. You know, Fellini could have cast his very strange movies out of the 10 people who were in the bar at 8 o'clock on Friday in November of 1975. But like all of us with this very similar coming out stories, I soon figured out what times to go and what bars to go to. And there was a bar in those days called Ties, T-Y, Ties, that I was very fond of. And I would go into Ties, and in the beginning, like everyone else coming out, I was terrified, fascinated, both at the same time. I had dropped a great deal of weight. I was working out regularly. I was 32 years old. And I would, in the beginning going into Ties, this is back in the days when there was still a lot of police harassment. If you left the bar and crossed the street, you got arrested for jaywalking. We called it gay walking in those days. The patrons, though I never saw such a thing, were all still afraid of police raids on the bars, which had happened, though again, I never saw such a thing happen. And almost everybody was closeted. There was no significant gay rights movement. Now, there were things going on, the things I recounted in the history, the students particularly, the very young crowd, Craig Covey and the Gay Activists Alliance, and all of that was going on at Ohio State by this time. The Stonewall riots, this is 1976, so they were 7 years. This is 7 years after the Stonewall riots. And in the beginning, I'd go into Ties. The bar was right near the front door, and then it was a long building.
Where was Ties located?
Across from the Greyhound bus station.
All right.
South of it.
All right.
And they ripped it all out to the city center. So the city center is now on top of what was Ties. And that was a great loss. I loved that bar. But in the beginning, I'd go in, and I would hide the bar. You could go all the way around the bar on all sides of it. There was one side up against the far wall, and in the corner that was dark. That's where I'd sit. And I was absolutely astounded to see men affectionate with one another, obviously gay, and there was a dance floor down at the other end away from the front door. And to see men dancing with one another was almost beyond my comprehension. And for like a 3-month period, I didn't do anything at Ties other than sit in that corner of the bar, got to know the bartender. And finally I started wandering around the bar, went down and stood at the edge of the dance floor and watched people dance, and this is the disco era. And I went home and bought myself a disco album and practiced in front of a mirror thinking, could I do that? And thank God I did that, because I got asked to dance not long thereafter, and pretty soon was into that whole scene.
When you were growing up, did you ever hear people talking about other gay people?
You know, I've tried to think about this, what homophobia I was exposed to, and there must have been some. I can't remember an incident of any kind where the issue was raised at all by anyone. Now, there have to be such things. It's just, I've tried to think about it, but I don't remember things. On the other hand, I certainly knew it was forbidden, and I was very, very determined not to be a homosexual. So I was in denial up until 1975 in the marijuana period.
When you say you knew it was forbidden, was your family particularly religious? Was that the source of it?
I was reared a Catholic, but Catholicism never really took with me. And currently I'm an atheist. I mean, I not only gave up Catholicism, I gave up Christianity and God. But I don't remember any discussion within the Catholic Church about the issue of homosexuality, so how I knew it was forbidden, I'm unclear on. I was as homophobic as anyone could have been, I remember in 1972, McGovern ran for president against Nixon, and this is 3 years after the Stonewall riots, and all of a sudden there are all these gays urging gay rights, and he was a very far-left Democratic candidate. I don't think he carried any states at all. He might have carried his own state, which I believe was South Dakota. But he took within his organization the very embryonic gay movement, and I remember thinking that's ludicrous. You know, homosexuals, gay rights, how silly does that sound? A little aware that 4 years later, I'd have to start to have stirrings of some gay rights thoughts of my own.
Did you know any other people who were gay when you were growing up?
No. Pretty sure that's the right answer. I mean, you look back and think, I wonder if Major Murphy was gay. She was always over at our house getting drunk, and he was a big, butch kind of woman, But I have no reason to believe she was, except she fit the stereotype looking back on it.
Did you ever serve in the military?
Yes, I joined the Navy right out of high school in 1961. My father said to me, "You don't know what an honest day's labor is, and if you go immediately to college," which he gave me the choice to do, he said, "what you'll do is do what I did." He went to Indiana University and learned to play pool. And he said, "Why don't you get your service obligation out of the way, and then you'll be very interested in college." And in those days, there was a service obligation. You were highly likely to be drafted if you didn't join the service. So I joined the Navy right out of high school, did 2 years active duty, 2 years going to meetings, 2 years inactive. And then just as the Vietnam War hotted up, I got my honorable discharge, and I was in law school, laughing as everybody else was, terrified of being yanked out of school and sent to Vietnam. And I was getting checks from what my roommates called Uncle Sugar. I walked between the raindrops in that one. That was just the most amazing thing. I, due to other circumstances, caught up with my own age group in terms of education. So that couldn't have worked out better.
In your youth or your early adult years, college years and so forth, do you recall any gay jokes, slang, expressions, anything along those lines?
When I was in the Navy, I was on board a ship out of Norfolk. And at one point, we had to move the ship's library, which was tiny, to a new location, and they decided to use the ladies' restroom, because it was never utilized, of course. There was such a thing on board the ship. And there were various jokes about homosexuals being the people who would use the ladies' restroom, But it was all... I never saw anything vicious. I never saw anything other than what people thought were, just pretty mild bag jokes kinds of things. Oh, now, wait a minute. College, they caught two guys together. I was at the University of Maryland. And they caught two guys together in the dorm room. But all that happened there was people laughed at them in a rather good-natured way. It didn't seem to affect them much. So I don't remember any ugly incidents involving gays growing up.
You are open about your sexuality.
Now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And is that unlimited?
There's a stalker currently going on.
Is that unlimited with all people that you may come in acquaintance with?
Oh, yeah, I've gotten brazen about it. As a result of all the things that happened to me, I'm impatient with anyone who doesn't know. And try to get that out of the way if it's someone I'm going to have some contact with. I retired last summer, and I started, back when I was married, my wife and I played bridge at the tournament level. Then when we got divorced, we stopped playing bridge. But since I retired, I went back to playing bridge, and I have formed all these friendships of people my age or older who are into playing bridge. And the three that I'm closest to, you tend to form teams of four for certain tournaments. I took them each aside and said, "I want to mention this to you before you see it in the newspapers." And think, "God, that should have told me that." They've all been very supportive. But yeah, I don't allow people who are becoming close to me not to know.
You've talked a little bit about this before, but a few more questions about dating, love, and marriage. Earlier you talked about initially when you went to college you had a number of sexual experiences with women before you then determined that you were interested in men. Is there anything else of note to mention about that?
Well, I don't want to make it sound like I didn't have homosexual experiences. I was in that God was I drunk last night school. You know what I'm talking about. And I made a big deal for quite a period of time, starting in the Navy, and up until I finally did come out, of seducing men who thought they were straight before they met me, because then we were just straight guys having fun together. And I developed a set of 5 rules on how to seduce a straight man. You want to hear these? There are 5 rules. Yeah, you write this down. Those of you who are listening to this is important if you want to seduce straight men. There are 5 rules. 2 of them were absolute, and the other 3 were waivable, depending on the amount of alcohol involved. One was, it had to be very clear that they were straight and that this was just fooling around, that they weren't gay. The second rule was, it had to be very clear this wasn't going to cause problems. It wasn't going to be the sort of thing that would have ugly publicity kinds of consequences. Those were the 2 unwaivable rules. The other 3 varied. One of those was no kissing or anything that demonstrated affection. The 4th one was that typically they didn't want to do anything particularly active. That is, they wanted to just more or less lay there and have it all happen to them. That was fine with me. I mean, I'm a gay man. Give me a good-looking body. And I know an awful lot of things to do with it. And it frequently meant that you could fuck them. Because, they were just being passive. Okay, well, Doug, you work them up to it and give them enough alcohol. And the final thing was, when it was over, they didn't want to talk about it. It was slam, bam, thank you, ma'am. And if you kept your mouth shut, you frequently got repeat business. Okay, those are my 5 rules on how to seduce a straight man.
So, even though your realization of your gay identity didn't happen until after you were married,
that's right.
You had gay experiences much earlier than that.
Oh yeah.
And how did you categorize that in your head?
I didn't think about it at all. That is it. I was so ashamed of the urges and the actions that I didn't think about it at all. There's a play called Cloud 9 by Carol Churchill, in which a mother is asked, "What did you think about your son clearly being gay 10 years ago, when it became obvious?" And late in life she says, I tried not to think about it, so I don't know what I thought. And I think that was my reaction too. I closed it off and didn't think about it. It would be something that happened, and then I wouldn't deal with it at all.
Prior to deciding that you were gay, how did you meet these people in order to have these interactions with?
Typically it would be something social, and it would progress from a little alcohol to more alcohol to, why don't you just spend the night here, and that kind of thing. And again, these were people who did not themselves think of themselves as gay, nor again did I.
Do you believe these people were in fact gay?
Oh, I don't know. I think they were. A lot of them were with what one of the founders of Stonewall, Steve Wilson, used to call equally confused people.
After you realized you were gay, or after you identified yourself as being gay, you talked a little bit about meeting other gay people at bars. Were there other places here in Columbus that gay people met?
There were cruising areas, and I was never much for that, but there used to be an area just north of campus on High Street. You know where Larry's is?
Sure. The bar?
Yeah, about 3-4 blocks north of there. There was an area where men would drive around in cars and pick each other up. I did that exactly once in November of 1975. And then I didn't like all of that. I'm a lawyer. That all sounded to me hugely dangerous. I was never the kind of person who went out to parks or public restrooms. Boy, Arps Hall used to have quite a reputation, the restroom down there as a cruising area. But I did almost none of that. All of the meetings in the early days were through bars, or you'd be invited to I wanted so to get into the social circle here in Columbus. And I was scared I wouldn't qualify, you know. And the social circle among men was an older crowd, had all these parties where people were rather effeminate, and it was done primarily there were a lot of potlucks and that kind of thing, but most of it was just finding sexual partners in a fairly loose environment. That changed not long thereafter as the gay rights movement got going. But there was this very powerful crowd. I can't even remember names. One of them was Dolly, who just died recently. Was always a wonderful person. And the first time I was invited to a gay social event, one of my law students had a lover and they threw a party. I was just ahead of time. I couldn't have been more nervous. You know, so, well, is I going? And then I got there, and it was less intimidating than I thought it was going to be. And of course, I've never been a shy, quiet person. So that was going on. Rhonda, this is the period where the baby boomers were taking over the world, and the hippies and violent things were going on in terms of world events. I moved to Chicago in 1968, just in time for the riots at the Democratic Convention. Walking to work one morning, I saw a group of people push through a plate glass window by a police officer. And the women's movement was getting going. Black Power, and Martin Luther King was assassinated in 68, so was Robert Kennedy. And all of that kind of energy kept fueling things all during the 70s, and it was going on at the time that I'm moving into the Columbus area. And there were embryonic gay rights things were coming to people's attention too. But in February of 1977, which is a year after I moved here, I went to a Valentine's Day party and had one of those lightning strike kinds of things. I looked across the room, and there was clearly the man I was going to spend the rest of my life with. His name was David Mary, and he had the exact same reaction to me. And what is amazing was that he is not the kind of person I would describe as my type. I mean, I generally like very masculine men, lots of muscles and so forth. David is a very attractive person, but he's slightly effeminate, and so nonetheless, boy, was that love. And we came together like two magnets meeting. And within a week, we had moved in with one another, and we had a 4.5-year relationship that eventually broke up. But that started at just a Valentine's Day party.
What was the level of promiscuity in the community that you first stepped into in Columbus in the 70s?
Oh, every bit as good as it is nowadays. I mean, people hopped in and out of bed with one another like bunnies. And I think it was even more than it is currently, because it was comparatively rare that people paired up. The homophobia of the day kept people in the closets, kept people in denial, and made them unwilling to publicly identify the way you have to if you're going to move in two men together or two women together. That suddenly would label you in a way that was not acceptable during most of the 70s, except by fairly brave people, people who had nothing to lose. So I think there was a great deal of that slam bam thank you man going on that I think we will never get away with it because men are such pigs. But Rhonda Rivera, a well-known name in the Columbus gay rights story, Rhonda Rivera, when she gave her lecture at the 20th anniversary of Stonewall, said that when she was looking for the gay community, she discovered there was a men's community and a women's community. The men's community was organized around sex. The women's community was the women's rights movement just getting going, and they were having huge organizational difficulties because they couldn't use Robert's Rules of Order, for example, because that was created by a man and was patriarchal. And so they were trying to run meetings without Robert's Rules of Orders, and she said it was chaos. She said, so the men were trying to reach coitus and the women were trying to reach consensus. Climax. The men were trying to reach climax and the women were trying to reach consensus. But there wasn't a gay rights movement in the sense of any sort of central organization working at it. Now, there were little things going on. At Ties one day, they put up a poster that said, anyone interested in empowering homosexuals, they're going to have a meeting at like 8 o'clock on next Wednesday. And I went to that meeting.
Now, what year was this? Do you recall?
It's got to be 76. Maybe 77, but no later than that. And I went to the meeting, and I forget who the speaker was, but he got up and he was saying the kind of thing that Rhonda said a lot in later times. Okay, you're in the closet. Okay, you can't afford to come out, but you could send checks anonymously. Rhonda, that was one of her big lines. You know, you can always write checks from the closet. And if you can't open the closet door, at least you can have a louvered door. And so for years, I think I still got it somewhere, I had a file at my office marked louvered door, in which I threw in clippings or things, but I was interested in the whole idea of there being the possibility of someday having a gay rights movement.
How many people were present at this meeting, do you recall?
10, 15.
Do you recall did you know any of the people who were there?
I may have known one or two of them. I ought to go back to Doug Comes Out, that story, as to how I found people. When I started going to Ties, and the Kismet and various other bars, and I started running into my law students. That was quite an experience, too, because, of course, the gay law students were out there, and I was a very popular law professor. I was also going back to Indianapolis, where my wife and son were still living, and I'd go out to the gay bars there, and I'd run into my former students. There was a guy one night at the bar, now a young lawyer in town, turned around to the bar with 2 drinks in his hand and saw me standing there and dropped both drinks. And so I had a support network I was picking up almost immediately of law students. And then they would introduce me to people, and, and it widens out from there. So at this meeting, it wouldn't surprise me if some of the law students were present, too. In fact, that's highly likely.
Do you recall anything coming out of the meeting? Any organization being formed or events being planned? Or?
No. That doesn't mean that something didn't, but... And I'm pretty sure I knew that at Ohio State there was a gay activist alliance going on, but I avoided any contact with that because I was very heavily closeted at the law school. Now, in 1976, I came in January, and the great Rhonda Rivera arrived. We hired her as a permanent member of the faculty that year, and she started in September of that year. And almost immediately, I had law students in my office saying, there's a lesbian. And there's the story that I tell on in the gay rights DVD presentation on the early days about, I asked Rhonda to go out to lunch with me because I wanted to come out to Rhonda. And she had just gone through a divorce. She was living with her then lover in the house that they had bought together, and she thought I was hitting on her. So Rhonda is ducking the whole idea. And for like a 2-week period, she wouldn't go out to lunch with me, even though our offices were like 2 doors from one another, and I ran into her constantly. And I didn't want to say anything in the halls or something, about. So finally she agreed to go, and she said, we got in the car, and I said, let's go over to the such and such restaurant, which was at the Holiday Inn. And she thought, oh God, what kind of hitting it? So as we were driving there, I said to her, are you aware we're involved in a common social difficulty? Which is how I phrased it. I thought of this very carefully ahead of time. She said no, and when she tells this story, I've got a video of her doing it at my 50th birthday party. She's sitting right on the couch where you are in this video, and she's telling this story. She says, I was scrunched over on the passenger side near the door. And Doug suddenly said, I'm gay. She said, at which point we both expelled a lot of breath, but confessed we were both gay. And then we had a wonderful lunch that went on for like 2 hours, sitting at this restaurant and talking. And at one point, one of us asked the question of the other, if the dean calls us in and asks, are you gay, what do we say? Do we admit it? Do we lie? And to show you what a very different era that was, and given who Ron and I subsequently developed into as people, I can't remember how we came out. That is, whether we said we'd lie. Rhonda was not tenured at that point. I was, but she wasn't. So coming out could have been a hugely dangerous thing for her to do. On the other hand, she was so early active, an activist for gay and lesbian rights, that everyone knew more or less months after she arrived that she was a homosexual. And she wrote very early on, when it wasn't smart to do in terms of her career, a groundbreaking law review article that she published in a very respectable law review, the Hastings Law Review, on homosexual cases. And she wrote a series of law review articles about the state of homosexual rights in the country. Part of this series were called Queer Law, Part 1, Queer Law, Part 2, in a day when you didn't use the word queer in anything other than a very derogatory way. But of course she was using it as a pun because the cases were so horrific to read. And we're talking about an era where if one gay person left to his or her partner everything in a will, the wills would be challenged for undue influence, and 80% of the time would be stricken. Just because they had a homosexual relationship, therefore obviously the will was impermissible. And Rhonda would collect all those cases and do her commentary on them and so on. And Hastings, right before she retired, did reprints of the most widely cited articles that the Hastings Law Review had ever published, and Rhonda's was right up there. I mean, it was an obligatory cite in any discussion of gay rights and much cited by the courts, but typically cited for homophobic things. The courts don't allow this, the courts don't allow this, citation to the Rivera article. So Rhonda was very brave, and in a way that I was not. I was terrified. I was going to be found out. Now let's remember, I was still married. My son was living with David and I. So it was a very different era. I was scared some student was going to find out and publicize it all over the law school or ask me in class. I started every class I ever taught by saying, are there any questions? And up until about the early 80s, when Stonewall really got going, I stopped caring, but in those early days I was terrified.
You mentioned before meeting your first lover out at a club. Why don't you take a minute and describe to me the typical gay relationship as far as living arrangements, duration, commitment, monogamy, those kinds of things?
Well, there weren't any rules on this. One of the things I met that very first year, there was a couple, Will and Charlie. Will, whose name I could look up, was a national figure. He taught at Ohio State in the art department, and he taught illustration, and he was the leading illustrator of dogs in the United States. And his illustrations of dogs were published on the cover of magazines, and he put out a calendar every year, and he charged a lot of money if someone wanted his dog drawn. And Will and Charlie got together when they were both in their early 20s. Well, Will was 10 years older than Charlie, so one of them was 20 and the other was 30, that kind of thing. And when I arrived in Columbus, they were touted as an example of what we all ought to look up to, because they'd been together for 55 years. And they had quite an interesting history. And they had a big party for them when they turned 50, and then they started lying about how many years they'd been together. They got embarrassed by it, so they were every year they'd say it was 50, and it got up to 55, and then Charlie was 10 years younger than Will, and I went over to their house at one point. They threw a party, and David and I went, and they were cute together, and of course they were old at this point. At one point, Charlie was fixing a fire in the fireplace, and he turned around and said, "Boy, I haven't been on my knees in a long while," and we all laughed and that kind of thing. Charlie, just like the fairy tales, had inherited a great deal of money when his rich uncle died. Will had made quite a bit of money in his career, So the two of them had money. Interestingly, Charlie died first. He was the younger one, and Will died within months. It was one of those, there was no use living, and they always say that the death of longtime partner is the biggest shock in life, and of course, again, they were old. So that was the exemplar of what was possible, was Will and Charlie.
And where did they live at?
You know, I no longer remember.
And
David would know.
And you indicated that one of them was employed at Ohio State.
He was a professor in the art department.
And how was the other employed, do you recall?
I think Charlie, I don't remember the details, but as I recall, Charlie had been sort of a ne'er-do-well, who was flitting from job to job to job, who suddenly inherited a lot of money. But I could be maligning the man, I don't remember enough details. Will was a highly respected person, and if I keep talking about him, I'll remember his last name. Because again, but it wouldn't be hard to find either. The leading illustrator of dogs in the United States in the mid-'70s was out of Ohio State. It's the kind of thing you Google up and find it pretty fast. And I used to put these calendars around there, and they might be in the stuff I'm giving to you.
Other observations about relationships?
Well, like David and I moved in together almost immediately. And again, that was love with a capital L. And we had a wonderful time together in that honeymoon period. That was wonderful. And in those days, you sort of came out slowly. You'd come out to your neighbors, you'd come out to your best friends, and and you drop the pearls one by one, was the saying in those days, until it became an open secret. And it was like that at the law school. Eventually, a huge number of the faculty knew I was gay, and they met David. And David and I, we threw a party for those faculty members who were in the know, which was a substantial number of the faculty, and we did it in a sort of in-your-face, we demand to be treated kind of way. And that party would have been, let me think, in 70. That party has got to be 1979. We met in 77. We moved to the place where the party was at the end of 77. So, and we were there for 3 years. So, it's somewhere in there. And we threw that party twice, so it's got to be 79.
And what sort of reaction did you receive at the law school when you became more open about your sexuality?
There were faculty members who had their own difficulties. There was one faculty member who called me into his office early on before he knew I was gay and made a derogatory comment about Rhonda being a lesbian. And since her research assistant, and Rhonda, she was, and I suppose still is, the most organized person on the planet. And she would have an army of research assistants gathering every case, every mentioning the word homosexual, and she had files that eventually she donated to some place because they were so very valuable. And Randy Schultz, in his book Conduct Unbecoming about the gay rights movement, thanks Rhonda Rivera. He came to town for a whole week and just camped in her office and read all her military files. And Rhonda, from the very beginning, had this organized, and they tended to be, though they were not exclusively gay, her research assistants tended to be gay. And frequently, but not always, women. And the rumor spread that she was sleeping with the students, which was not true. Rhonda had a relationship with a woman named Pam, and they broke up after. It's got to be, well, David and I are still together, because Rhonda introduced David to the woman she's still with, Margaret Morris. But Rhonda was not sleeping with the students, and I heard one of the faculty members clowning around say something about that, and I said very sharp things to him to make it clear that this was not true, that this is the sort of vicious thing that could hurt someone's rumor, that it was impolitic of him to be spreading these kinds of rumors, and I would advise him never to say anything like that again. Rhonda, on the other hand, was always a bully, and if she heard me say that, she'd nod her head up and down. The joke was always that she'd have made a much better queen than she would have an elected official. And when I was interviewed at the 20th anniversary of Stonewall by the Columbus Dispatch, Mark Ellis being the reporter there. He sat here in the same room and we had interviews. And unfortunately, he started the article with my quote that you have to understand that Rhonda Rivera was a despot. And when Rhonda came to town later, a couple of months later for that dinner, I went out to supper with her and I said, "Now, Rhonda, I want you to understand when I said in print that you were a despot, I meant it in the best possible meaning of the word despotism." And of course she laughed. I mean, she knew exactly what I meant. Rhonda was bullying everybody, including all of the faculty, the upper administration. We had a Democratic governor, Celeste, in those days. She browbeat him into signing an executive order and throwing a party at the governor's mansion for the embryonic gay rights movement. And the joke around campus was the way that you ask, "Are you gay?" The code words were, "Do you know Rhonda Rivera?" And that meant that the faculty who objected to what was going on were more or less forced to shut up, or they'd have had to deal with Rhonda, which wasn't pretty. I mean, Rhonda, she is an awesome person to deal with, and a force like a hurricane.
How did she get away with being so aggressive? What allowed her to be successful in seeking things while being so aggressive?
Well,
During a time period where people expected gay people to be quiet.
Well, again, you have to remember that the faculties, the law school faculty, for example, had gone through the 70s constantly being battered by civil rights movements of various kinds, the move for racial equality and the women's rights movement. That's when I arrived in 76, I was told there's no chance we're going to hire any more white males, that they had done far too much of that, and so I think that, and the times were clearly changing, and people didn't know what, at the law school kind of level, what was happening. And Rhonda took advantage of that confusion. And again, you didn't mess with Rhonda, or very bad things would happen. I don't mean that she would do anything unethical or illegal. It just, suddenly your reputation among the students would plummet to nothing if you were caught being homophobic. We, at one point, had a faculty meeting at which, I'm sure at Rhonda's instigation, so by this time I'd have started having some effect on these things too. We made a motion that we wouldn't allow people to interview our law students unless they signed a non-discrimination pledge that included, and then there was the normal list, but sexual orientation was being added to that list. And that was a fairly contentious faculty meeting. One of the faculty members, who I will not name, who to this day I believe is gay, but was heavily in denial and was married, stormed out of the room. Well, we'll never have people willing to interview at Ohio State Law School in the future if we adopt this awful thing and so forth. But for it went right through. I mean, the vote wasn't close by the time it was over, so Rhonda had won yet another one, and then she bullied the university in adopting a similar rule and the governor into the executive order, and she was down working on the administration downtown, though it was Republican, and that was the Dana Reinhardt days, and he was homophobic. He used to talk about homos openly in the press.
Any other experiences relating to gays and lesbians at Ohio State, just specifically to Ohio State?
Well, you know, there are lots of them. I just tried to pull them backwards to which ones were important. Rhonda got together a group of people where we also met at the law school to form a gay organization within the university community. And she called up all the gays she knew, and she knew a lot of them, and insisted we all meet at the law school, and we formed this organization. I'm not sure if it still exists. It had one of these alphabet listings as a name, you know, the gay and lesbian faculty and staff at the Ohio State University. And by the time you put the alphabet together, it had one of those things. And then it had to be amended to make it GLBT. And I'm not sure if it still exists at all, but Rhonda started it. Let's see. Well, we tried to get a student group going at Ohio State Law School of the gay students. students, and the problem was identifying gay students. Ron and I used to have a competition. Could I find more gay men than she could find women? One year, now I know what year this is because Elliot Fishman is the person involved, and I taught Elliot property in his first year. He would have started in 81, so this has got to be, and I taught him in the spring of 82. So this is either 81 or 82. Ron and I are going to throw a party. We always threw a party for the gay law students. And Rhonda, we started moving that party, I'm not sure when it was in the early 80s, but as the time went on, we tried to throw the party earlier and earlier in the school year before they figured out that they shouldn't come out. That was Rhonda's theory as to how we throw the party. And it was rare that we ever had more than I think 20 was the maximum number of students. And there was a whole period in the 80s where we had no one at all. That is, during the Ronald Reagan era, gays stopped going to law school. I've since run into a number of them, but they were all in hiding in those periods. But in any event, in this 82 thing, Elliot Fishman comes into I was trying to get as many gay men as I could, or gay students of any kind. I wasn't discriminating against the women. It's just Rhonda typically had them all rounded up. There was an open lesbian who was in my class. This has got to be the spring of 82. She knew about the party coming up, and she brought Elliot Fishman, who became quite a name in the early days of the Columbus gay rights movement. But in these days, he's in his first year of law school, so he's like 22 years old in this story. She brought him into my office, and we closed the door, and she said, Elliot tells the story. I heard him tell it one time at an awards dinner. He says, the woman says, Elliot Fishman would like to come to the party that you and Rhonda are throwing. And I don't remember the incident at all, but according to Elliot, I say something like, and is Mr. Fishman eligible to come to this party? He indicates that he was, and I think bringing him in meant I won that year. I found more gay men than Rhonda had found lesbians. But then Charlie Munell, there's a name, Munell, might have two N's, Munell. Charlie Munell was a law student. Oh, this has got to be very early. This has got to be like 77. Charlie wanted to form a gay rights organization, and he couldn't find anybody who was willing to sponsor it, not even Rhonda, who wasn't out enough that she was willing to be the sponsor. So they went to John Quigley again. He's the communist, very far left person who did amazing things in that lecture that I gave. He's the one who got gays first into the city ordinance and all of that. John Quigley agreed to be the sponsor of the gay organization. And then Charlie Munell went down to the associate dean who runs the law school on a just administrative day-to-day basis and asked for office space and was told no because gays were not a legitimate minority. At which point pressure was put on them, and eventually I think they did end up giving office space, so it wasn't that first year. And again, then the organization would graduate and suddenly we would have no students at all. Nowadays, to show you how times have changed, the law students at the Ohio State Law School have got 40, 50 people in their organization, and they call themselves, I love the title, the Outlaws, and they're involved in this big dispute with the Christian Legal Society that you may have heard about that led to the lawsuits. And there's a television program I was on a couple of weeks ago that led me to having a stalker and all kinds of things going on with all that. But like Stonewall, it went from being nothing to now a very substantial group of people.
Let's talk a little bit about local politics. First, after you moved to Columbus in the 70s, do you recall any coverage of gay issues, events, controversies, scandals, anything in the newspaper? Did you ever see the words gay or
they would have
paper?
Periodic roundups, as they still do, of cleaning out the parks. And that sort of thing would happen. And people's names would be in the paper. And people would lose their jobs as a consequence. There started to be, as the gay rights movement started up, not just the obvious players like the early Stonewall groups that were doing things, but Mary Jo Kilroy, for example, who is now currently a commissioner in Franklin County. She's a former student of mine, too. She got elected to the school board through pure guts and determination, and she forced a sexual orientation thing through the school board. Now, she is not a gay person herself, but you talk about brave. So that sort of thing would turn up in the press. And to this day, she's one of the heroes of the gay community, and indeed she was one of those top 20 people when they had the big celebration 5 years ago, 4 years ago.
Do you recall any gay rallies or protests?
The summer before Stonewall was formed, there was like 100 people marched around the State House. That would have been the summer of '81. I was not involved in that, and I don't know why I wasn't, because I was out sufficiently that I would have been had I been aware of it. And that got a little bit of press. And before that, it's got to be before that, because Dave and I broke up in '81. And so it's got to be like in 1980, there was a gay pride march in Cleveland. David and I and one of my students, a man named Sam, hopped in the car and drove to Cleveland. And we marched. That was the first march I was ever in. That's almost got to be 1980. And that was like 150 people. And it was on a beautiful summer afternoon. That's the first march I'm aware of. Then Stonewall was formed in the fall of 1981. And we had our first gay pride parade the following June. And thereafter, it's still going on, whatever number this is coming up next month.
After you first moved to Columbus, were there any public figures or elected officials that were either known or suspected as being gay?
No, I don't remember anyone who fits that description. Instead, what we had was the opposite. We had a lot of homophobia out of these people. The representative in the United States Congress was a man named Columbus Whaley. And at one point, he told the national press that he had no gay people who were his constituents. And his area included both German Village and the campus. You know, so Chalmers was wrong on this, but he told the national press there was no need for gay rights, at least not in Columbus.
When you first moved to Columbus, were there leaders in the gay community?
There was no gay community in the way you're talking about. There were little pockets of this and that going on. Social groups, like I mentioned to you, or the women were organizing, and there were a lot of lesbians within the women's movement, but they had their own problems of being discriminated against by the women's movement. Though the women's movement was off and on very proud of the lesbians, a lot of them were famous names within the women's community. But they were primarily organizing not for lesbian rights, but for women's rights. And so in those very early days, there wasn't much in the way of organization. Again, there was a gay rights group at Ohio State University, and
besides the bars or the clubs and the social kinds of potluck get-togethers, were there other sorts of organizations or groups that you recall at all? Anything?
The Kismet, which became the Columbus Eagle, was run by, I believe, a straight woman who rumors was homophobic. But they threw an annual outdoor get-together, cookout party, and it was held on a farm west of the city off of Broad Street, and way out in the country. It took forever to find it. And it was like the 4th of July every year, and it was a famous event. And people would go there, all men. They play volleyball, they swim in the creek, they show off their bodies for one another. There was a cookout, they'd get drunk, and then they'd all go off into the cornfields and have wild sex. That Kismet party, boy, that was a big deal every year. And I myself made quite a fool of myself for about 3 years in a row doing that. The bowling league got going at some point, and I'm not sure when, but it was, and perhaps still is, the largest gay organization in the state. At one point, in a day when this was an extraordinary number, they had 400 people right here in Columbus in that bowling league. There were various embryonic groups that would get going. In my gay rights lecture that I gave for Stonewall, it's on that DVD, I hunted up some names of things, organizations that have died out. There was an organization of lesbians, Sophronic something or other. It's got to be from Sappho, but I don't know what, these organizations would start up, sputter along for a little while, and then die out, which is true, I think, most organizations. The chances of an organization lasting, I think, is very problematic. We can talk about United Airlines, which is the kind of thing that makes me so proud when I look at Stonewall.
Any scandals or major problems that come to mind within the GLBT community?
Well, of course, there were things that developed once we really got going. In that same presentation I gave on the history of gay rights, we talked about when our president turned out to be, was arrested for an S&M scene that went awry, and it turned out he had been in prison for molesting a young teenage boy. And so, I mean, that was a bad scandal.
You're referring to Stonewall?
Yes.
Okay.
That was quite a scandal that Stonewall had to weather once upon a time. It was Russell Stock. When you look at the list of Stonewall's presidents, you and I are both in that list. The reason Chris Kozak suddenly comes back in after having been president, she was the first person who ever did it 2 years in a row. Then Russ Stock took over, and all of a sudden he was out of office. He resigned. And Chris picked the ball right back up. She's another person who's done an amazing amount in the history of Stonewall.
I think now would be a natural time for us to talk about Stonewall. Why don't you tell me your perspective on how it came to be and your involvement with it?
As I said when Stonewall gave me the Rhonda Rivera Human Rights Award, I'm of a different generation than the other people who started Stonewall. I'm significantly older than most of them. And gays of my generation were, first of all, ashamed of being gay. And then when you started to get over that, instead of replacing it with pride, we replaced it with anger. I've never gotten rid of my anger. But I'm not as angry as I used to be. I was fueled entirely by anger, the injustice of it all, what was going on with perfectly innocent people, with the horrific things that would happen to them. I got madder and madder and madder, and I started caring less who knew that I was gay, to the point where I was content. And I was a tenured full professor. I'm going to sound like I'm bragging here, but this is the kind of thing that gave me the position of power from which I was able to move. By the time I retired, I had won 8 awards for outstanding teaching. Almost all of them voted by the students from 3 different law schools, including an all-OSU teaching award given to 8 people every year in 1978. That's the year I nearly died from ruptured appendix. That was an amazing year. And I'm a fairly famous name in my field, which is commercial law. I've published 7 nationally known books on law teaching. The student guides, I've written 3 of those. So I'm a big name in my own field. I'm a tenured member of the faculty. And I could therefore come out without it having the slightest harm to me, and indeed I brought to the gay rights movement this sort of reputation. The group that actually got Stonewall going were all OSU students and their lovers. And the 3 who are the big names, and who you certainly ought to interview, are Craig Covey, Craig Huffman, and Val Thogmark. Having said that, they each were partnered, and their partners were dragged into, some more willing than others, and some of them important in the early days of Stonewall in terms of their time. They all made a contribution, but I'm talking about big contributions. Craig Covey, I'll talk briefly about each of them. Craig Covey is one of my heroes. You asked who I, think of it. Now, Craig joined, and I believe it's true of both Val and Craig Huffman also, joined the Gay Activist Alliance at Ohio State University in the 70s. And again, those are the kind of things they got going after the Stonewall riots of 1969. And the Gay Activist Alliance was one of the earliest formed groups. That book I recommended to you in the email to you, oh God, is that wonderful. And it talks about, right after the Stonewall riots, the first major national group that was formed was the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF. But it was so clearly tied in with communism and so forth that the more moderate gays broke off from it and formed the Gay Activist Alliance, or the GAA. And there was an Ohio State group. Craig Covey and Val and Craig would have all joined that group. Craig, at some point, became president of the group, and John Quigley, the straight faculty member at the law school, was their faculty advisor. Having graduated from the university, as they all three did, I believe, I know they all graduated, but I think they were all three OSU students who graduated. They were each looking around as to what to do next in the summer of 1981. Now, I'm not sure of their actual graduation dates or what they had been doing in the interim. Craig Covey's partner, in those days we said lover, was an even younger person, a man named Steve Wilson. Steve was a beautiful man, just gorgeous, good looking, smart as a whip, and the kind of person, if you were looking at someone whose career was going to go somewhere, you'd buy stock in. I at one point offered to loan him money if he needed it to stay in school, because it was so clear he'd be able to repay it, among other things. And he became a computer expert, and he was the treasurer of Stonewall in its earliest days. He was on the committee that first gave us a computer and got the computer up and running. And those are the days when computers, were very primitive machines and so forth. So Stonewall owes to Craig Covey's lover, Steve Wilson, a great deal. He's now living out in San Francisco, and I've got his address around here. We exchange Christmas cards still. I always thought the world of Steve. And he and Craig broke up, 3-4 years after Stonewall was formed, and went their separate ways. Val Thogmartin, his lover was Keith McKnight, and in Stonewall's early days, Keith McKnight was the kind of person, he's dead. He's dead now. He died of AIDS. Keith was a real sweetie, the nicest guy in the world, and he was willing to jump in and do gopher kinds of tasks. I mean, he was a worker and helping getting all of these things going, and was hugely useful for that reason. And he and Val broke up 3 years or so after Stonewall was formed. Craig Huffman was the loose cannon on deck. He's the kind of person in any organization like this who's your bomb thrower. You've got a guy in Stonewall nowadays who turns up at all these meetings and rants and raves. He turned up at the Unitarian Church and was yelling at the crowd and so forth. That's the kind of person Craig Huffman was. He would go down to the gay bars and bully them all into signing up for donating money for this or holding this event. If they wouldn't do it, he'd accuse them of being homophobic. And he'd be thrown out of the bars. I mean, we were always doing damage control on the things that Craig Huffman did. And on the early television show, he'd go on the air and explain why this politician or that politician was not worthy of support, and he'd use very inflammatory language, so we were always running around doing damage control on that. On the other hand, that sort of person is very useful, too, because he's your bulldog, and occasionally you need a bulldog. His lover is a man named Dennis Valot, V-A-L-O-T. Dennis is a lawyer. Dennis was always very closeted, and for all I know, still is, and might be horrified to hear me identify him like this, but Dennis, it's time to come out of the closet. He's a tax attorney here in town and has worked with various government tax agencies through the years. he and Craig broke up, and then they get back together, and they break up, and they're the kind of lovers who, even though they are no longer a couple, are still good friends. And if I was trying to find Craig Huffman, I'd look up Dennis below in the telephone, and if Dennis was to return your call, he can find Craig for you. Craig moved out in the Clinton administration days, and moved into the Clinton White House circle and was doing all kinds of things in those days, and at one point was in the Pentagon. And every time I go to D.C. and walk through DuPont Circle, I'd suddenly hear someone yell, "Doug!" And I'd turn around and it'd be Craig Huffman. So those were the 6 people that started Stonewall. Craig Covey and his lover, Steve Wilson, Val Throckmorton, his lover, Keith McKnight, and Craig Huffman and his lover, Dennis Below. Craig Covey is a force, and all these people were forces of various kinds, and they were all intelligent, they were all dedicated. Craig Covey is a force like Rhonda Rivera was a force, and the organization that resulted out of this, that you were president of, is largely built on the interplay between Craig Covey and Rhonda Rivera and other people I got in here at some point and pulled on my oar in a way that I'm not embarrassed by. But Craig and Rhonda, who did not always get along, were nonetheless 2 people who you did not mess with. And Craig, this is also true of Rhonda, but Craig is an incredibly brave person. In days when it was very dangerous to do so, he publicly identified himself as a homosexual. And I'm talking about in the press and on TV. And he, in situations where you didn't even need to, would put on gay rights buttons and wander into situations filled with homophobes as far as the eye could see. Union halls and things like that. And in the early days, I'd go with him. We had quite a dog and pony show, Craig and I. And I wouldn't be wearing any of these buttons, and I'd sort of slink along hoping nobody would notice me. But Craig was in there, and he has a lot of personality. He's glib and fast, and people liked Craig. And he was good at dealing with the press. He was good at dealing with the politicians. He was good at getting along with people, though he and Rhonda had battle after battle after battle after battle. I mean, Craig was the first president of the organization and its first executive director, both at the same time. Now, all right, here's the formation of Stonewall. First of all, I'm not involved in the very earliest moments. Jerry Falwell, the Reverend Jerry Falwell of his Baptist church, was starting up an organization called the Moral Majority, which was creating chapters all across the country, and it was decided to create a chapter here in Columbus, Ohio. And there was a protest that was to be held at the Columbus Moral Majority meeting was going to be held at some place. Oh, goodness. Now, I'm going to get this wrong. Craig, the 2 Craigs and Val would have all the details right, but it's something like this. It was being held at this church. And they decided to get together all of the liberal organizations, and there wasn't a gay one in those days, but including a lot of gay people, and I think I was at this protest. I was certainly at a protest about the Moral Majority at some point, because we snuck somebody into the church under guise of being one of their members just to see what was doing. Nothing came of the formation. This would have been like August, September of '81. Nothing came of that Moral Majority forming, but the 2 Craigs and Val said, we have to start a gay rights group. We've got all these gay people who are willing to come to this thing. Why don't we start creating a gay rights organization? And I've got the dates on all of these things. I used them in that lecture that I gave on the history of gay rights in Columbus. And the reason I have dates is I've always kept a journal. Now, it's not a very extensive one, but it records everything I do all day. Like my journal today will say, had an interview with Rob for all of whatever period of time we've got. And so I've got the dates on when all of these things happen, and I can look them up for you if you need them. Or again, that video, I gave you a copy of that. It has got the dates in there. But what the two Craigs and Val and their lovers started doing was trying to get together a group of people who would come to an organizational meeting. And the way they did this, and the way you communicated before the internet and before there were gay publications of any kind, was through the bars. So they went down to the bars and asked the various bar owners if they could put up a booth and ask for people interested in the formation of a gay rights organization to sign up a list for this organizational meeting. One of the bars in the town in those days was the Garage, Trends Garage. Were you around in that day?
Yes.
Trends was the bar up in front, and the Garage was the big dance area in the back. And I walked into Trends, it's got to be that fall, and Val Throckmorton was sitting at the booth. Well, I say booth, it was a table with a sign taped to the front of it, gay rights organization being created. And I walked right over there and I said, sign me up immediately. By this time I was very ready. And so the organizational meeting was held. It wasn't Craig's house, it was Val's house. Val and Keith, Craig, Huffman, and Dennis. I'm pretty sure it was Val and Keith's house. And now we're talking about student housing. And this is what I described in my various lectures as the cat hair days. Student housing then was every bit as shabby as it currently is, and these were comparatively scummy surroundings in which Stonewall was formed. And I went to this organizational meeting at their house, and there was like 10 people there. And we decided that it was time to create this organization, and from the very beginning it had to be politically correct. There had to be an equal number of men and women, was one of Stonewall's, and we had no women at all at this point, except Craig had a good friend named Cindy Cyrus, who was straight, but she agreed to be on the initial board. Now, Cindy caused all kinds of problems as time went on, but she was very heroic in the early days and was a nice person. She is now dead, too. Poor baby. And I said at this meeting, I think we can get Rhonda Rivera to join the organization. And they said, no, she's a famous person, you won't be able to. And I said, I know her. They said, and they looked at me as if, not Craig and Val, but other people in the room looked at me as if I was crazy, doubting that I knew the great Rhonda Rivera or that I could get her involved in the organization. And I said, I thought I could. We then, I forget what steps happened next, but we had, our first board was constituted, and I was on that, and we had our first organizational meeting. We started having meetings down at the bars. Val Throckmorton is the person who suggested it be called Stonewall Union, which was the original name. And we would go down like at 10 o'clock on the bars. We'd sign people up for the organization. We had no money whatsoever except what we pass around the hat, and then see if we could collect enough money to buy posters to put up signs down at the bar of our organizational meetings. We decided early on to have a press party and invite the press to the formation of the organization, and we decided to hold it at my house, this very room, being the focal point of the party, and because we didn't want to expose the press to the student housing that everybody else seemed to have in this organization. By this time, Rhonda was on board because she was at the party. Craig and various other people, the two Craigs, Val, ran around and cashed in all the chips they had with various members of the press. And we got promises from the Columbus Dispatch, from the TV shows, from various people involved with the radio, that they would all come to the party. So I think I threw some money into this one too. We had alcohol and we had snacks and cleaned up the house real well. I washed the windows and all kinds of things, and we all dressed up, put on our best attire and ties and coats and all of that, and no one showed from the press. Every single person backed out. And they didn't call and say they weren't coming. Just, we sat here and waited for the doorbell to ring, and we waited, and finally it became clear no one was coming, at which point we all got drunk and had a hell of a party. So, then we decided that it was important that we have a gay rights march. Marches were starting up all across the country as the anniversary of Stonewall, the last Sunday in June kind of thing. And we decided to pull off the first march in June of '82. Looking back, it was quite a thing, quite a fight to take, because we weren't really an organization except in our own minds. We didn't have any money, we didn't have any facilities. We were mostly meeting at Craig Covey's house, which is where he had that cat, Butch. Butch was the name of the cat. And the cat shed with the success of a collie. And so we were always constantly covered with cat hair as a result of being over there with that. And Craig's tiny little apartment on 8th Avenue right off of High Street, the student housing. And we'd sit on the floor and address envelopes and send out things, and we'd have to get enough stamps to send out things. Try to get that march organized. We sent out flyers to and posters and delegates to other cities to post things in the bars in Columbus, and such and such a date in June we were going to have our first ever Ohio Gay Pride March, and that they should send contingents, and we gave them the dates, and we're going to meet at Goodale Park, and we gave it as much publicity, and we were very afraid that we were going to have 100 people, and that it would be a pittance, and it would be laughable, and Stonewall would fail instantly at its first major public kind of task. A man named Ed Phillips was appointed to be the director of the parade, and he did an enormous amount of work to get it all ready. I run into Ed on the rare occasion from now and then, and I always look at him. He turns up in the video that's playing right here. At one point, standing on the corner directing people. He goes by real fast, but I thought, boy, if people knew that that's Ed Phillips. He was a good friend of Keith McKnight, who was Val Dogmartin's lover. Indeed, Keith moved into Ed. Ed had, and for all I know, still does have a very nice home off of Broad Street down by Franklin Park. And he used to rent out quarters there. And Keith McKnight and his lover Joseph Rhymes lived there for many years before they both died of AIDS. Then let's see. So, came time for the parade. We met at Goodale Park, and Craig Covey was so excited. We all were excited, because it was clear we were going to be a success. And Craig had someone with a counter, and I think the counter turned up with 825 people. Craig told the press that there was 1,500. Craig was famous for enormous exaggeration of the numbers. And he almost always just doubled whatever was the real number, or picked something out of the air. And the first Pride March, the photos, when I looked at it for that lecture I gave for Stonewall in 2003, I sat and watched the first Pride Parade. And I'm going to tear up thinking about it. The bravery of those people who marched that first march, that was just amazing. And they were from all over Ohio, Yellow Springs and places, student groups largely. Or bars would march, or the leather community, or the drag queens. Oh, Craig Covey used to get so upset about the drag queens, because that's all the press would focus on, them and the leather people. And the coverage was all like that. But we marched, and we had 825 people, and the march was the same sort of route that it still is down. We marched to the State House lawn, where we had a permit. And we had the Pride rally there, and we had speakers. I don't think Rhonda spoke, but I did. I had a famous speech that I used to routinely give for like the first 5 marches. There were protesters, of course, and they changed in number. There was a pretty small number at the first Pride Parade, but like in one of them, there were 500 people protesting, which is a huge number and a dangerous number of people. And what I would do, I was always the last speaker because I'd get the crowd going. And I'd get up and I'd harangue the crowd for a while and congratulate them for being there and say things like, "You didn't start your journey for self-acceptance on the lawn of the State House. You started in libraries where you pulled down books that lied to you. And the law told you were criminals, and your ministers told you were sinners, and the doctors told you were sick, but you have gotten through all of that. And you're now on the State House lawn celebrating your own personhood. Give yourself a round of applause. And, you know, I mean, and I'd get the crowd really going in those days. And I would always finish with saying, all right, now I'm going to pretend I'm one of those bigots standing over there with their signs, and I'm going to yell ugly words at you, and you're going to yell back the word bigot. Are you all ready? Pervert, bigot. Lesbo, bigot. Dyke, bigot. Fruit, fairy. And the crowd get to yelling bigot, bigot, bigot. And I'd always finish by yelling, pointing at the crowd and yelling, good for you, meaning two different things. It was good for you to do this, and it was good that you did it, you know, and and that first march, we finished it that way. We had Schwarzwalder. He was a state representative. Mike Schwarzwalder. First of all, he was knocked down, dragged out, gorgeous, handsome. Hollywood handsome. Second of all, he's straight. He got up, and he was our keynote speaker, and he gave this stirring speech, which was incredibly brave, and he's one of those people, too, that the straight community, that we owe a lot to our straight allies, because we couldn't have gotten this far without all those people working. Stonewall owes a lot to Schwarzwalder because his speech turned up on the press. And again, he's a good-looking man. It was very articulate. It was passionate. That was wonderful. When that march was over, and we all just disbanded, the march being over, the little Stonewall crowd, the group that I've mentioned, we walked through the streets just looking at one another. It is, when I look back on that moment, I was thinking about the other day, what are the highlights of my life? I mean, the moments where you have the big moments in your life. That was the greatest natural, that is no drugs involved, high I have ever had in my life. We did, I don't think we had high fives in those days, but we had the equivalent of that. We could not believe we had pulled off that march. We were just like children. We were romping, we were yelling, we were hugging one another, all those gays together. That was just, it was the most extraordinary. How many people were in the march list? You tell me.
In the march, I'm not sure. But at the event, I think they were estimating like 60,000.
You know, I mean, that's, we went from that to that, and, you know, goddamn, it said something. That was amazing. We had a group that marched with paper bags over their heads. Yeah, that was the kind of crowd. Val Throckmorton was on a float that we built, and it was a rickety thing. You can see it on the tape. It's hugely funny. He's on a ladder that is a step ladder, a good size one, and he's up at the top of it, and it's got signs on it about gay rights and Stonewall Union and so on. And Val is waving something, a flag or something, back and forth. And he's an obvious target, therefore, of the homophobes, and some guy along the side of the street started throwing eggs at Val while he's being paraded through the streets. And Val's ducking the eggs, and there's a police officer standing there, and Val yells at him and says, "Guy throwing eggs." The policeman walks over, and this guy's got a bag, a paper bag filled with eggs, and the policeman just hit it with his nightstick, and that stopped that. I mean, there were little things like that going on.
Was there any difficulty in getting the permit for the parade, or getting the ability to use the State House lawn?
Yes, yes, there were, and I don't remember those stories. Rhonda got involved in that one. That's what she must have been involved in the parade, because at the last minute, it looked like we were not going to get a parade permit, or we didn't get it, and we marched along the sidewalk. There were problems with those permits in the early days, and it wasn't just that first parade. We overcame them. We always marched, and there was never any legal action taken against us. And that's the kind of thing where the Craigs and Val and Ed Phillips and people like that and Rhonda would have more stories as to exactly how that happened. I was involved in an interesting thing along this period of time. It was January of '82, so this is before the Pride March, and Stonewall had just been formed the following fall. I got a phone call from the University of California, Hastings Law School, which is part of the University University of California systems, but it's a freestanding law school. That is, it's not connected with an undergraduate institution in downtown San Francisco. And they called and asked if I would be a visiting professor there for the 82-83 school year. And snow was swirling around the building, and David and I had broken up the year before, after 4 years. We were together 77 to 81. And so I'm a single gay man, asked if I'd like to spend a year in San Francisco, and, Rob, I was willing to do that. So I left in the summer of 82, just temporarily for a year, rented out my home to somebody who was visiting here as a member of the chemistry department at OSU, and spent a year in San Francisco, and it is that school year, 82-83. I came back in time to be in the Gay Pride Parade, the second one we held in 83. So that was the hiatus. Now, important things happened to Stonewall in that year, and in some ways I wish I'd been around, because I could have been helpful in a way that was very hard to do long distance. Stonewall nearly failed in that year as a result of the following rift, about which I have only, mostly, just hearsay, but that all the other people I've mentioned to you can give you chapter and verse. Stonewall had created a board, and it was decided that they needed to have a separate person who was the executive director and someone else be the president of the organization. Now, the very first year, I think Craig and Val shared the presidency, and Craig was the executive director, and Val was the assistant executive director. They were paid nothing. So when I ask you, what are we currently paying the executive director, it's laughable to compare the nothing that we went to what is currently going on. And the first president of the board, who was not Craig or Val, was Rick Romilly and Jerry Mayer. Rick Romilly and Jerry Mayer were both big names in the early days of Stonewall. Rick Romilly was a good friend of Craig and Val and all of them, and they made him the first president of the board. That was not the original founders. He had a lover named Jerry Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, who was the nicest guy on the planet, and everyone loved Jerry. They both have since died of AIDS. Rick and Jerry did. The next thing I hear, I'm out in California, I'm starting to get phone calls from both Craig and Val. They're having huge battles between the two of them, to the point where Stonewall's going to fail. The battle, and again, they've got the story and I don't know. We'd started a TV show, and Val was in charge of the TV show, though he and Craig did a lot of, and Craig Huffman too, did a lot of work on that TV show. And we had politicians like Cindy Lazarus, who was Cindy Cecil in those days, was on the air, and I was forever going on the air to explain how to come out, or the history of the gay rights movement, and there are all these tapes of me on those television shows that were huge fun to do. And of course they were broadcast at times when no one ever saw them, on but they were repeated enough. I heard from people about those things, and they were fun to do. The one I'm proudest of, I did right before I left to go to California, because I had a copy of it I took to California with me. And it was on the history of the gay rights movement. It's the one that started, the thing you introduced me about the Nazi Germany, and when the Nazis were defeated and they came to liberate the camps, they let out the Jews and they let out the gypsies and the handicapped and the communists, but they put the gays back in prison to term their terms, and I'm up there yelling at the camera. I was hugely hungover when I did that. I remember coming in and thinking, am I going to be coherent? And, in those days there was a lot of drinking and drugs and things going on. But
And this was on public access?
Yeah. And I came in the next morning after this big night out, and I sat there, and they turned the camera on me, and all of a sudden, again, fueled by anger, I had it all. I had it written out on a little sheet of paper. This topic, this topic, this topic. Not what I was going to say in detail, just those topics. And I'm very proud of that tape. The quality of which is not that good. Oh, Craig and Val. they got into a big dispute about the TV show itself, what direction it should take. And this dispute got to the point where Val, who was more or less running it all, quit. But because he had the know-how to do it, started his rival gay TV show, leaving the tiny little remnants of Stonewall Union to try to pick up and keep that show going. And now we had competing gay television shows.
What were the names of these shows? Do you recall?
No, but again, that's easily found. These people would all know. I, other than being a frequent speaker and occasional commentator in terms of panel discussion kind of things, I was not much involved with the television show. It is where I believe it still is, down on Oak.
Mm-hmm.
And but I wasn't running cameras or that kind of thing the way a lot of these people were. I mean, there were advantages of being the law professor when there are all the students kind of people. So Val and Ed Phillips, who had directed the first parade, were running the rival organization, and they both resigned from Stonewall Union, and it was not clear whether or not the organization was just going to die at that time. And I'm dealing with, people are calling me with both sides of the thing, and I'm out in San Francisco trying to deal with all of this. And the organization nonetheless struggled along. I returned to Columbus in May of '83, and about this time, Rick Romilly, who was the first really elected president of the board, resigned. I forget why. Some business opportunity came along and he couldn't afford to do it both the time. And it's not like Stonewall was this hugely important organization. You know, it was, people would just casually quit, and we had no money, and, you know, it was just barely there. So he resigned, and a woman named, I'll get her name wrong, but she's listed in your list of the presidents. She's the one that follows Rick. Susan Pyle, is that right? I believe it is. She became president of the organization. It used to be that the president and who's the person, vice president, were always of different genders. Is that still the case? Anyway, Susan became the president of the organization. Now, we always had our election of new officers in the fall. That's still the case. And Rhonda Rivera decided that she was going to run for president. You know, this is like King Kong deciding that he's going to move into the zoo. You know, you're going to notice him. And Rhonda ran and won, and suddenly all the people who'd been running the organization were more or less out, and Rhonda took it over, though Craig is still the executive director. And I have returned to the scene, and we had the new board met in the law school, in the faculty lounge, and Rhonda had us all hold hands and promised we were going to work for the future of gay rights in a new way. It was a 4-hour meeting, and I hate meetings. It was one of the most exciting things I ever sat through, watching the great Rhonda Rivera organize things. And she took this organization that was just teetering along and almost about to fail, and whipped it up to the organization that is still up and running on its own. And she has enormous talents for motivation, for organization, for connections. She put Elliot in charge of raising money, and Elliot Fishman was out there, you know, beating the doors and singing and dancing in the bars and doing everything he could to get money for the organization, because no organization can run without money. And it was decided that what we needed was a community center. And Jerry Mayer, who was Rick Romilly's lover, had died of AIDS along about this period of time, and he was a very popular person, so she organized a fund, the Jerry Mayer Fund, which was then used to help fund Stonewall. For all I know, it still exists too. We took the organization from then on was not in as much danger of foundering as it was that very first year. And Rhonda was knocked down, drag out, wonderful at keeping it going and keeping the pride. And she brought into the organization her hairstylist, Dennis. I'll put Dennis's name, but again, he's listed in that he became president at some point. I'll think of Dennis's last name in a moment. He also has died since then. You know how that was in those days. I'm not sure he died of AIDS, but AIDS wiped out an awful lot of these people. And Rhonda, towards the end of her presidency, and no one held it for more than a year in those days, no one wanted it for more than a year, not even Rhonda, she announced that she was going to run Dennis to be the new president. Well, Dennis was a nice guy, but he had no political consciousness whatsoever. He was not, shall we say, an intellectual. He was very effeminate. And I didn't think of him as a serious person. And I was astounded that Rhonda wanted this to happen. Rhonda took care of her friends. And she would get people on the board, and she was good at bullying them into doing it. She'd say, you only have to go to 4 meetings a year, because the board only had 4 regularly together. Of course, that was a lie. I mean, she was about to make them devote the entire rest of their lives to being her slave. And I was outraged that Dennis was about to become the president of the organization, and I decided to stop it. And I had the wherewithal, if I wanted to take it away from him. And I didn't want to, because my talents do not lie in administration. I hate meetings. I don't like to run things. I'm a solo force. But Rhonda and I took her to lunch at L'Armagnac, was the name of the restaurant in those days, and it was run by good friends of ours who was a gay couple. And we had lunch, and I had told her that I was thinking about running for the presidency of Stonewall, and I was doing this so she would give up on leaving it to Dennis and would decide to run a second time herself. That's what my goal was. And we had lunch, and I said, if you decide you're not going to do it, then I'm going to run for president of the organization. Again, I was bullying Rhonda, which was something else to try, into doing this. The next day she called me up and said, okay, it's yours. And I thought, oh, God, no, I've got to become the president of Stonewall.
Do you think she actually planted one move ahead of you, and that was her intent all along?
No, because she eventually did put Dennis. He did eventually become the president of the board. So then I became the president, and we had a retreat. I'll mention some of the other important people. There were lots of things going on by this time. The Human Rights, what was called the Human Rights Campaign Fund, they dropped the fund part of it, was going, and Rhonda was on their early board, and Steve Schellebarger, and there are a lot of important names and other things going on other than Stonewall in this period of time. But as far as what was going on at Stonewall, another important person turns up in the mix about this time, Robert Haverkamp, Haverkamp. Have you met Haverkamp? He is one of the graduates of the law school, though he graduated before I got there. And he's worked his way up in the organization at Ohio State till he's more or less running the university. And I used to clown about that, but he said to me, sitting right here one night, he said, you used to clown about that, but he said it's sort of true. He draws up the agenda for the Board of Trustees meeting and runs around and does a lot of politicking and is one of those powers behind the scene. And Robert Haverkamp is another force to be dealt with. He's very smart, he's very dedicated, he can be sort of brutal in getting his way, and he is the person who drafted Stonewall's Constitution and pulled it through. And when I was president of the organization, Robert had some office, I forget what, vice president or something like that. And we went to lunch a lot, and Robert was really good at organizing things and getting things done, so we decided to have a retreat. I'm not the person who thought this up, but it is decided Stonewall ought to have a retreat, and it is arranged that we will do this, and we will do it at some church outside the city. And it was in February of, that's got to be 85. Yes, that's right, February of 85. And I've been president now since the previous fall. I also, in January of 85, started a 12-year relationship with a man named Jerry Bundy, who also became a big deal in Stonewall at one point. He became president at some point. But at this point, we weren't even living together. And I go off to the retreat, but I'm in love. That was the greatest feeling. And the retreat is all the biggies that were involved in Stonewall in the day. And there was a group of women led by a woman whose name I won't identify because I don't want to, that were out to get the men. And I know this sounds like I'm making that up, but she used to talk in private with other people about putting her claws out and retracting them at will. And I'm clueless as to what is going to happen at this retreat. And I ought to say that while the organization didn't suffer while I was president, I was not the best person to run the organization. I didn't believe that meetings ought to go on more than an hour, for example. That was one of my rules if I was running meetings. And I can bully people too, and that didn't make me very popular. So we got to the meeting, and we're doing all these touchy-feely kinds of exercises where you have to fall backwards and be caught by other people and all of that. And the woman who was the facilitator was very good at it and keeping us all on track and having us do exercises and making us all work together, and even Rhonda and Craig were working together rather well. But the facilitator had to leave early. And as soon as she left, the attack began on the patriarchy that was running the organization, with the two primary targets being myself and Robert Haverkamp. And really ugly things were said. And I kept trying to say, well, but surely we can all agree that it isn't the individual people that matter. What matters is not self-aggrandizement. What matters is keeping the organization going. You don't believe that. I said, of course I believe that. No, you're just out here because you've always wanted to run this organization. I said, no, I was more or less tricked into running this organization. Oh, and that would be given the horse laugh and so forth. And it was bloody. And Craig Covey, the sissy, ran and hid more or less to keep out of fire. And it wasn't pretty. And when I gave my lecture in 2003 about the history of gay rights in Columbus, sitting in the audience was Robert Haverkamp and Lyle Saylor and his partner, David Ringer, are sitting there, and they had been at this retreat. And at one point I'm up there lecturing, and I said, Stonewall's had its ups and downs. I won't tell you, for example, about the retreat of February 85, and I saw the three of them just put their hands to their head and cover them. And I thought Stonewall was going to fail as a result of that retreat. I thought and I was running around trying to keep people from resigning and pushing real hard, and we've got to mend these fences, and we started to have much longer meetings, and we'd have facilitators at the meetings, and we got through it, but that was close. Then, let's see, there are other things that were going on that were very important. I'm trying to keep it all together. I thought of them just a moment ago, and it left me. There is that big 1984 battle down at City Hall where we tried to get the ordinance through, and I'm not going to talk about that on that tape, but if someone wants to know, drag out my history of gay rights in Columbus, and they'll get a full earful on that battle down at City Hall, which we lost. We were so naive. We lost there as a result of the organization of the religious right, and that wasn't pretty, and that was a scary time, too. Rhonda was escorted from the building, surrounded by a phalanx of people who were protecting her from physical violence. It never occurred to me to be afraid until I looked at the tapes later, because I had said some rather impolitic things. Craig Hovey was up there. That was quite a good deal, and it was more dangerous to be doing gay rights than it is nowadays. My phone was filled. And I've always been listed in the phone book, and I wasn't the only one. All these people, Rhonda and Craig and all these people, but because I was a fairly well-known person in the community and a law professor and all of that, and I would get a lot of it, death threats, and hate mail, people leaving things on the answering machine, both at the office and at home. And my mother taught me how to handle death threats. Did I say this as part of my lecture? My father was a prosecutor in Dallas, Texas. And he was prosecuting, he was the head of the career criminal division, that's the mafia and similar entities. And so he was always getting threats, and Mom, therefore, was getting threats. She said, Doug, what you do is, this is before caller ID or any of that. She said, you hit the cradle a couple of times very quickly, and you say, operator, this is one of those calls, please trace it. She said, they hang up instantly, and the opposite happened of what they planned on. They called to scare you. So I adopted that tactic, which worked rather well. Craig and I, and Rhonda and Craig, but particularly Craig and I, did an awful lot of radio TV work. And we're talking about Fred Anderley, him on WSU, or 4-hour call-in shows. Craig and I did a number of those. And we're always on the air with people calling in, and the homophobes. One of my favorite things to do was talk about people who are anti-gays or bigots. Oh, would that get the lines lit up? I'm not a bigot. Oh, yeah? Well, let me ask you the following questions. And you teach law through a Socratic dialogue, question and answer. And I was good at this. I'm still good at it. And I get the people to talking about these things. And Craig was knockdown, drag out, wonderful. And we called ourselves the Dog and Pony Show. And we got better and better and better at it. One night on the air, someone called in and said to Craig, what do you do when you see a good-looking woman? Craig said, I wish I were a lesbian. Another time, we had a woman call in, and we had one of those biblical discussions. We were always discussing the Bible. And I worked this woman around to the point where she finally said, well, I don't believe God would create people to be gay and then call it a sin. I said, I don't believe it either. Thank you for calling. And we hung up on her. Dennis became president. There was a woman who followed me in the presidency. Vivian something. Schaefer. I believe that's right. And she made movies. There is a movie called You Can Fight City Hall, about that City Hall battle, which I always thought was an ironic title in that we lost down at City Hall. To call it You Can Fight City Hall seemed to me to be wrong. And she was followed into the presidency by Rhonda's Dennis, the hairdresser. Now, he had a lot of... Dennis was a nice guy. Why can't I remember his name? But he liked to throw parties, and he would overspend the budget for the parties. And when this was pointed out to him that he had wildly overspent, he would cry. Dennis's response to any trouble was he would cry. And later, I would run into Dennis, years later, I'd run into Dennis at the bars. And we'd stand there and talk, and he'd had a few drinks, and he'd say, Doug, if I could be president of Stonewall Union, anybody could be president of Stonewall Union. What could I say? I thought it was true. Then, my lover was Jerry Bungie, who was a lawyer. And Jerry got very interested in reviving the battle to get the gay rights added, or gay protection on the basis of sexual orientation added to the ordinance in the job protection employment area. And it was decided to work behind the scenes, and I'm not sure who the president of the organization, I think it was Ed, but they constituted a committee, and Rhonda, Marty Dom, there were a number of people who were on that committee. And Rhonda went down and talked to the mayor, who was Greg Lashek, and he agreed not to veto it. And it was decided to run it through City Hall under the radar, to get it through where it wouldn't be controversial in any way because it would be hidden. I mean, we were just going to lie about what was going on. Jerry, who had been president of the organization at one point, drafted up the language that was eventually adopted. And they had one of these things where they had a reading and it was sneaked in and no publicity was given, and the city council approved it. Now, there is a rule under the city ordinances that if a city ordinance is passed, and the voters decide they don't like it, and they have a referendum on it within 60 days, I think it is. It might be 90 days. I think 60 sticks in my mind. If it's then defeated at the referendum, it can never be introduced again as another city ordinance. It would have to be overdone by referendum. We were terrified, therefore, that it would come out in the press that the city council had adopted this gay rights ordinance, and that there would be a big blow-up as there had been in '84. This is about 87, 89, might be the early 90s by this time. I think it is. 92 sticks in my head, and I looked it all up again when I gave that gay rights lecture. I think it is 92. And so we sneaked it through, and they passed it in such a way that we had the gay rights march during the 60-day period that year, and so we couldn't announce it, and we were terrified that one of the speakers, it was a secret the gay community knew a lot, that one of the speakers was going to blab at the 92 Pride March. But no one did blab, and then it went through, and it got added to the city ordinance as a matter of right. So we finally won that battle. I suffered a burnout about that time, too. About the time we hit 1990, the early 90s, I stopped being involved in gay rights. It had been a pretty bruising and long-fought battle on behalf of lots of these people. Oh, I would tell you about Craig Covey leaving the organization. In 1982, no, it's got to be 85. In 1985, Craig Covey was offered a job by the state of Michigan to run their AIDS organization. And he was wavering on whether or not to take it. And I told him, you'll have to move to Detroit. Detroit was falling apart, still is. I told him it's like rowing back to the Titanic to move to Detroit. But it was running a state agency, and Craig wanted to take the job. And Rhonda, boy, she was anxious to get rid of him. And I wrote Rhonda a rather vicious letter, sternly worded, shall we say, telling her that it was not in Stonewall's interest to get rid of Craig Covey, who had done wonderful things. So Craig left, that would have been the summer of '85, and moved to Michigan, where he still is. And he's still running that state organization up there, so he's easily found. He comes down here to party every once in a while and frequently spends the night with me. So now we had our first search for an executive director, and by this time we were paying Craig a pittance. I think $1,000, which we didn't have, to pay him anything. But now for the first time we're actually going to have to hire someone, so, we've got to beat the drum, and we still didn't have a community center at this point or anything like that. So various people wanted to become the executive director. Rick Romilly wanted to become, he'd been the first president. His lover, Jerry Mayer, wanted to become the president, and the two of them were working as a team. And for various political reasons, it was decided it was smart to hire someone from the outside. Now, I no longer remember the name of the person we hired as the first executive director following Craig. But he was only here for a year, and he was a knockdown, drag-out disaster. He didn't do anything. He didn't earn his salary. And when he left, there was something like 3 months of unopened mail found, with checks in it and things like that. Then they hired a woman who was the executive director, and we've had a woman named Carol Cohen, and she was quite good. And so, once again, Stonewall almost failed as a result of the ball being dropped at key moments. And when I said in my lecture, there were like 50 moments in the first 5 years of the organization where it nearly failed, I wasn't kidding. It was close. There were times when we just had no money. And there were times when we just had no leadership. And those kinds of things, it was amazing to see that eventually that was all, it stopped being the problem that the organization was going to fail.
How were the money problems solved during those days?
Donations. Well, we'd hold events that would earn money, and the bars were wonderful at contributing. There were a lot of the bar owners to whom we owe an awful lot. Todd Anglin. Did you meet Todd? Todd Anglin and his lover, Ed, I forget their name. Ed's name. He died of AIDS. Well, they both died of AIDS. They both got on the board, Ed and Todd, and they were wonderful at making sure all the local gay businesses, and particularly the bars, contributed money. We couldn't seem to get grants of any kind, though I know Stonewall now relies quite a bit on grants. At least that didn't happen in the early days. And there were, Rhonda and Elliot were wonderful at bullying people in the community with money into contributing money. And just as we were about to fail, we'd send Elliot out to hit up these people one more time. Can you give us enough money? We can do a mailing. The mailing will then help pay for the next step. And lavender listings would help earn money. But money troubles were just huge in those days. To the point where, again, it's impossible that tiny little fledgling organization resulted in the one that you ran last year. At the time of the parade, where they had the 20th anniversary of the first parade, and they ran us all through the streets in those limousines, convertibles. Craig Huffman was trapped in Washington, D.C. and couldn't make it back. And at 8 o'clock in the morning on that Saturday, it was Saturday. Craig was helping Saturday.
Yeah, back in those days.
Well, in the first years, it was always held on Sunday, but at some point they started moving it to Saturday. And anyway, Craig Huffman called me at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I'm not a morning person. He woke me up and said, Doug, tell them I tried to get there, but I can't make it out of D.C. I'm trapped by airline troubles. He said, and I'm not so sure I want to be known for something I did 20 years ago anyway. I said, oh yeah? You know what Stonewall's budget is nowadays? He said, no. I said, $400,000. And there was this hugely long pause on the other end of the phone because he didn't believe the number. And then it sunk in and he said, oh my. Because from the cat hair days to those kinds of numbers and building buildings and moving on and so forth is just almost beyond belief. And to look back on all those early days and think, by golly, we ought to be very proud of having fought those battles and how it all won and so forth. And the things that Stonewall has done under the leadership of all the people who came along, Chris Kozat and that crowd, and up through, and all the people I don't even know about nowadays. I don't know who runs Stonewall anymore. Up until you came in, I hadn't known who the president was for many years. I got dragged back in when Bill Clinton did his Don't Ask, Don't Tell, those battles. I got dragged back into being back on the television circuits and so forth. And I'm still dragged out from time to time. We had that big controversy down at the law school where the outlaws reported the Christian Legal Society and so forth, and they decided to do a television show about the resulting thing at WOSU, and they had a 10-person panel run by, the moderator was Erin Moriarty on 48 Hours on CBS. She's one of the law school graduates and former student. And she was running the panel, and the panel discussion, they had students who were members of the Outlaw and students who were members of the Christian Legal Society, and Vice President Bill Hall, who's the one who issued the order finally letting them do it, and two law professors, both experts in constitutional law, which is not my area, arguing about whether or not it's unconstitutional to discriminate against the Christian Legal Society. And they brought me in just as an old-time gay activist, and they had the national president of one of the members of the national board of the Christian Legal Society, another former student of mine, Judge Moore, who was seated right next to me on the panel, and she had her Bible right there. And so here I am, and this was it's to be televised this fall. It was actually done last month, but it was being beamed live to the law school auditorium. And I said some things that got people upset, which is my want in these situations. I said things like, I don't believe that it's appropriate to use the Bible for hatred. And that if I were the members of the Christian Legal Society, I couldn't put my head on the pillow at night and be comfortable with myself because I'm discriminating and causing huge trouble to very good people who have done nothing wrong just because of my reading of an ancient text. And that the dishonor of that would bother me a lot. I said the reason that the religious right keeps losing all these battles and will ultimately lose every single one of them, including gay marriage, is because they're on the wrong side of the morality of this issue. What's moral is not to discriminate against people and cause them suicides and all these troubles and so forth simply because of an orientation over which they have no real control. And at one point I said, who would Jesus discriminate against? Which I thought I have, as a result of this one, attracted a new stalker who calls here every once in a while. He wandered into the law school auditorium off of the street and was particularly upset with the remarks of Professor Whaley. And he keeps calling me and explaining to me that I'm going to go to hell and godless heathen. And I told him I'm going to report him if he calls again to the telephone company, and that is the work of the police. So here I am, after all these years, I finally got my own stalker once again.
When you were talking about Stonewall before, do you remember when it was first decided to form this organization? What were the initial purposes?
Well, we had a mission statement. Val had a copy of it. You talked to Val, and Val's still here in town, and he still occasionally does things for Stonewall. He'll turn up doing very menial tasks. I've seen him at Stonewall events, and I think, don't you people know who that is? You know, he's the person who named it Stonewall Union in the early days. And that he came back to Stonewall is nice because, again, he had that big riff with Craig back in 1983. It was a big breakup. But Val would have but the mission statement was the same sort of thing that we are still saying. At the very first Pride March, Val could be seen on the tape, which I used it when I did my lecture in 2003, telling the press that this isn't a protest, it's a Pride March. And that was always one of the big focuses, that we were determined to create gay civil rights and make gay people proud of themselves and all of that. But that we weren't going to be burning down city halls was made very clear. And we always, again, we were part of that big civil rights movement that was the racial anti-segregation movement and the women's rights movement and the handicap movement. So that our mission statements were filled with politically correct things like that. And from the very beginning, we had to have parity on the board. It wasn't very long after we got going and Robert Haverkamp's writing the Constitution that we had to have a certain number of minority members. And all of that from the very beginning was important to Stonewall. And it was very hard in the beginning to get enough women to get involved because it was an organization that was created by men at a time when the women's rights movement was very powerful. And if Rhonda hadn't come along, the organization would have also folded because she brought in the women.
Were there other gay organizations that you were involved with here in the city?
If I say no, tonight when I'm putting my head on the pillow, I'll suddenly say, oh, well, I was a member of such and such. But nothing of any moment. Unlike Rhonda, for example, who was on the National Board of the Human Rights Campaign, and Craig Covey, who was on all of that. But they were great organizers and great going-to-meeting kinds of people, and I am not.
When you think about what it was like living in Columbus, being gay, when you first moved here and today, what are some of the differences, or what are some of the things that strike you?
Well, as I said when the organization gave me that Human Rights Award, there's been a breathtaking change. I mean, it is nowhere, and all across the United States, not just Columbus, all across the world. It is now permissible to be openly gay, and at least in polite society, no one thinks anything of this. The politicians who are homophobic are like dinosaurs. They're dying out. And we keep winning all of these battles. The gay marriage one, all right, we're currently losing that one, but Connecticut just adopted domestic partner benefits, and California is about to do so, and the courts are going to get involved in all of this, and it can be ugly for a while, but the new generation that's coming along, my nephew, for example, he was involved when he was 10 years old. He's now about to turn 19. When he was 10 years old, they had a school project where they put the children into little groups, and they were asked to create a utopia. If you got to run the world, what would be the rules? And it was my nephew and a girl and another boy, and the other boy didn't say so much, so it was my nephew, Adam, and this girl. And they were creating all the rules, and at some point they came to gay people. And they decided gay people should have all the same rights as everyone else. At which point Adam said, well, I've got a gay uncle. And the girl said, oh, I've got a gay uncle too. And they got to talking about it, and the next thing you know, the girl says to Adam, is your gay uncle with somebody? And Adam said, no. And he said, well, maybe we could get him. I'm being set up. by 10-year-old nephew. You know, I mean, and these are the people who get to take over all the polling that they do of the young people. This is not an issue they care about at all. And at some point, all the rest of us just die off and leave the running of society in their hands by the natural progression of things. So, in the end, being gay is going to be no more a big deal than being left-handed, which is always what we've been working for. I used to say routinely that our goal was to die out as an organization. Any more than you have left-handed people organizations. Now, it won't be that way because obviously gay people have more in common with one another than left-handed people have in common with one another. And so it was always said sort of facetiously, but it would be nice if Stonewall didn't routinely get the kind of phone calls I bet you still get down there. One year, when Jerry Bungie became president of the organization, he had the idea of having Stonewall save up all the hate messages that were left on the answering machine. And then we had a fundraiser, and he played it. Boy, did the money pour in. You know, because you forget how vitriolic it can be. So there's still a good idea for Stonewall. Want to raise some money? Have to save the tapes. Because there have to be, once a week or more, some crank leaves a message down there about... I saw Jon Stewart, when he was given that award at GLAAD, out in California. They gave him a media award. As he got up to address the crowd, he started off by saying, "Good evening, godless sodomites." Of course, you can get away with that.
In your view, having been involved in the community for a number of years, what do you see as the most important moment, or the most important moments? What do you see as the key points in time where something took place, or power shifted, or something was accomplished?
Well, I think if you go back and just listen to this tape, you can hear them. I mean, the moral majority trying to get organized, and the two Craigs and Val deciding to create an organization out of that. The Gay Pride March, that very first one. Rhonda Rivera deciding that she's going to get involved. Those, and that city council argument in 1984, where we were all over the press, and that got ugly, but out of all that ugliness, Stonewall found its feet. We were never in serious danger of failing after that big blow-up down at City Hall, because people were furious over that. And we got enough attention that people who hadn't been involved got involved. So those are the big highlights that I see, and I think anyone would see. But if you get Craig Huffman and Craig Covey and Val Thogmartin, and particularly Rhonda Rivera, to sit down, they'll have the moments too. It's important. Rhonda's 5 years older than I am, and I'm 61, so she's 66. It's important for someone to take that tape recorder down to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and sit down with Rhonda for 2 days and record and record and record and record. And there are people from Columbus who would have a visitor from time to time. They could be sent down with tape recorders. And she's not a shy, quiet person. Rhonda will give you an earful. And Craig Covey's up in Detroit. Be dragged down here. All I have to do is decide to throw a party and like a good-looking young man, and Craig will be here fast. Oh, I have a story. In 2003, when we had the Gay Pride March, and the one that was the 5-year anniversary, or the 20th anniversary, I had a date through AOL from this guy who was coming up towards the end of that day. So we had the big ceremony down there, and they gave us all the plaques and so on. I had to run home because I had this guy driving up from Cincinnati, and I had never met him. And when he came through the door here, about, 5, 6 o'clock that evening, he was knocked down, dragged out, gorgeous. I mean, one of the most beautiful men I've ever had a chance to have an evening with. And we had a great deal of fun, he and I. And he went out the door, and I went to bed with this huge grin on my face about 1 o'clock that morning, thinking about what a day it had been, paraded through the streets in that Cadillac and, given the award, and then this extraordinary sex. And I was talking to Craig about it the next day on the telephone, and he said, well, you see the connection between those two, don't you, Doug? And I said, between the incident with the guy from Cincinnati and the Stonewall awards? He said, yes. I said, no, I don't. He said, Doug, I did it for the sex. He said, I wouldn't have done it if it hadn't resulted in the ability to have sex whenever I wanted. He said, the two things are, it was all about sex. I said, okay, I see the connection now, Craig. And Craig always had beautiful men around him. He's still a good looking guy. No hair.
All right.
That's a good note to end on. It was all about the sex. The Craig Covey philosophy.